Alright, should be making a video again and such. And I'll just do this little extra crap that I have to do to facilitate the whatever interaction with others, if that becomes even possible, frankly, if they can stay on the subject, which is unlikely. So anyway, yesterday's video, I think I sort of decisively pointed out why it's not really reasonable what regular physics offers as an explanation for what energy is. And in a, they're all related to energy, frankly. Subject is the two-slit experiment. Now, neither one of these individual subjects were what I was involving myself in this physics investigation was based on. I mean, it wasn't, it was partially just because of these explanations, especially the two-slit explanation of waves of light thing. Really, for so many other reasons, I thought was an impossible to be true kind of theory. It's not mechanical enough. It requires too many properties for too simple a particle. Lots of reasons to dislike it, and to assume, that there's a better explanation, and that something's wrong in the details that were provided. And there aren't that many good details, frankly. There's just this, again, same problem of it just looks like something. So in the case of 1/2 mv squared as an energy formula, it can be understood that, there's only certain circumstances that can provide you some superficial reason to think that might be true. The fact that twice the velocity gives you 4 times the distance in gravity, or vice versa. You fall 4 times the distance, you only get twice the velocity. A not intuitive result, but an understandable one with a little bit of investigation and reasoning and logic. And likewise, their assumption that because there's a thing called an interference pattern, some on-off pattern, as I've stated so many times before, the simplest pattern the universe can create is on and off. So it shouldn't be a surprise that more than one event could possibly create on and off patterns, and that they even are kind of proudly say that we physicists know that whenever we see an on-off pattern, we're going to blame interference. And the idea that somehow photons have to have magical properties to do this interfering thing, non-regular properties, in the sense that it was kind of already known that you can't bang a photon into a photon, and somehow they were saying that these photons had to bang into each other because that's the only way they could account for the pattern. So anyway, but again, these were things I kind of fell on in recognizing that the whole idea of what physics was arguing is just way too many properties for way too primitive a function. So it's almost like saying that dinosaurs had a civilization, and they flew in flying garbage cans, and they did all kinds of, they had little smart watches and blah blah blah. It's just a pretty implausible theory, and somebody should argue against it. And it's just, I guess it's all part of the same theme of trying to move humanity from their phantasmagorical, religious, pseudo-religious, make up a fairy story for what a human being is and what our existence is and what it all adds up to, and they aggrandize the story with these fake narratives, and physics is just another fake, phony, false narrative that provides a bunch of magical, mystical, spiritual, living forces That really just don't have anything to do with reality. So anyway, but in my opinion, it's a decisive argument demonstrating that physics has very little credibility. You can't trust it. It'll tell you things that just aren't true, and it'll lie about the history, and it'll fake the whole argument. And it won't do any investigation, which just indicates that they don't have any confidence in these truths, these things they state to be truth, and they're just so confident that it is true, and they can tell you it is true, but there's clearly no passion to create evidence besides the rhetoric. Because I think if they know that, oh, we have photographs count, and now you have to have a photograph of Jesus walking on the water, they can't get away with just telling the story anymore. That this story isn't going to be fixed by providing evidence, because I think they know the evidence isn't going to come out the way they want it to. So this is famously called the Young double slit experiment, and the big lie is right off the bat they condition it so it's not a double slit experiment, so it really has nothing to do with it. So they always draw this simple primitive kind of drawing of the experiment, and the Young's analysis was waves of light, like water waves, travel through an impediment, and that somehow the light is bent like water would be bent. We can't just go through the slits like straight and just keep going in the direction it was going. In little straight little bars would come out, and they would just be, the light frequency would just come out and be two little spots on the screen, blah blah. And somehow it does what water does, which is has friction with the surface and creates a bent wave, and the bent waves go through space and create all of this other pattern, okay, where the peak of one wave intersects with the trough of another wave and cancels the light, and then somehow the peak and the peaks add up and create twice the photon, and then the negatives add up and create the unphoton or whatever. But anyway, it's just based on this superficial, it looks a little bit like it could be, okay, water waves, because water can create this pattern in one circumstance, this one. But in all the other circumstances, the single slit, for example, water doesn't do. And it doesn't create any pattern. And we know that light does. So they have evidence right there that, when you do a single slit with light, all you're going to get is one wave. And one wave isn't going to interfere with itself and create an interference pattern. It's not going to, there's no theory for creating these bars with one wave. And so they arbitrarily and just fakely created some synthetic math where they basically just cut this opening in two, and they create two waves out of it. And so then they can turn it into something that can be drawn with two waves. So the fact is that Young's analysis was technically wrong. Okay, just two waves won't create the double slit pattern, which has its own unique features, which I have highlighted many times before. But basically the rule is that there's two patterns. There's a clumping of the interference, okay, and then there's the little bars themselves. So you have little bits, and then you have collections of the little bits, and there's a very specific rules about how that comes out that they never talk about, where this is always an odd number here in the beginning, in the middle, and half of that odd number is what you're going to have as the other reliable nodes that you're going to get, and they're just going to fade with distance. So the point is that mathematically this won't create this pattern, and this is the double slit pattern. The single slit pattern is just you have a double maxima in the middle, which they never explain, and then you have semi-equidistant, equal size nodes. Now the truth is that if you really play this out, this pattern, that it won't create that kind of consistency. It's not perfectly consistent. And the fact is, the light that goes at different angles, it really should be viewed on a circular path so you keep the same distance. And if you do that, if you put it on that kind of path, you would find that the nodes get bigger as you go further around the circle and smaller as you go towards the center, except for that double maxima. And that's what really happens. So the light isn't some sort of consistent interference pattern, and it's certainly not consistent with what would happen in the water example. So there's obvious inconsistencies that are easy to see. I mean, the fact that two openings, okay, in fact won't create a single slit pattern, which they mathematically tried to convert it into. So what Jung's analysis said was, well, make the slits infinitesimally small, that is so slight, that they're smaller than a wavelength of light. And that basically destroys the double slit pattern, and all you end up with are the single bars, and so you're really turning a double slit pattern into what you get in the single slit example. It's mathematically the same thing. And that won't happen if you have these slit openings anything more than a wavelength of light, or a couple of few wavelengths actually. Then you will get the double pattern, and you'll have a real double slit experiment. So it seemed a weird qualification that they would say something like, well, infinitesimally small slits. Well, why should they be infinitesimally small? Why wouldn't people have regular size openings and shine the light through, because the pattern's created? So why this condition? And the condition is just because mathematically they have to turn the double slit into the single slit, because they can't explain anything about the double slit pattern. They can't explain the envelope pattern. They can't explain the bunching up of the interference. They can't explain the more complex pattern at all. They have no explanation, so they just evade it entirely and pretend that if they use these infinitesimally small slits, they can just evade the whole subject. Alright, so I probably should erase. So, I've played the Feynman video, played the Alcoholi guy, I played all these different people, and you write in their videos, they say things that just aren't true about detectors and doing this and doing that, and all these experiments that never really took place, and they never analyze the actual pattern. They just call it an interference pattern and just ignore the fact that they're fundamentally different patterns. So I'll draw them again here, just to illustrate. Alright, this is a double slit pattern. You have these decisive breaks in the pattern, okay, missing pieces. And the double slit pattern would be more like this. Alright, where you have a double maxima, and so they don't explain the double maxima here, and they don't explain this here. So the double slit, okay, versus the single slit. Alright. And so the evasion of just dealing with the actual patterns is part of, where you can just say that's, that lacks credibility. If you're going to tell us why there's this pattern, you're going to tell us what it's made out of, then you should be at least honest enough to know the difference between a single slit pattern and a double slit pattern, because they're not the same pattern. And the decisive point was, the one I didn't figure out for a number of years, was in their very rhetoric of saying infinitesimally small slits, because what I didn't realize was, by saying that, you're basically saying that the points, the distance you're using to create your mathematical, your geometry, was basically to say they're going to put the points so close together that they're essentially the same point. I mean, you can't see that there's two dots here, okay, because you don't have the resolution to do it. And the fact is, if I put two surfaces, I put 2 points, I put a distance in the equation that's small enough, there can't be a wavelength of difference. Because the longest point, the best I could go horizontally, I still can't make a wavelength of difference between the two lines. So any line I draw here, going to any point in space, I can't make a wavelength of difference between those 2 points in terms of viewing them. So I couldn't possibly create any interference. And so essentially, what I realized was this was a surface experiment, and the difference between the single slit and the double slit is just the number of, this is what you're really, the single slit has 2 sources. That's why it can make a pattern. It's because there's 2 sources, and they're this distance, which is their math, apart. And that works, okay? And the 2 sources are really just scattering photons, the elements of photons from the 2 sources. And you have a 50-50 chance that they're back in phase, and that's all it's about. Is that at some location there's a 50-50 chance that you have the right geometry and right distance geometry to have a full wavelength of difference versus the opposite of a full half wavelength out of being in phase. And so that's why you create a pattern, and it's not much more complicated than, just understanding that these are just the real places that the pattern is being caused by are the surfaces. That there isn't, there's no, if you're going to draw it as waves, you would have to put the waves right over the surface. So the surface is where the wave would have to be generated from that center. That would have to be the center of the wave, would be the surface. And then you can understand when they say infinitesimally small slits, then you understand that they're essentially taking these 2 surfaces and making them so close together that anything that scatters from one isn't going to be any much different than anything that scatters from the other, and they're essentially going to be the same thing. And so really the double slit experiment should really be understood as the 4 surface experiment, and that's all it really is. And that now you have 4 components. You have this point, you have this point, you have this point, you have this point, all producing pieces of photon, you could argue. And all you're saying is that you have an X and a Y piece, and you're just saying where are there 2 X's, where are there 2 Y's, and that'll create your pattern. It's basically a 50-50 chance of putting the photon back together again. And the 4 sources basically guarantee, okay, that if you have, they guarantee, it basically explains how you can have 2 different patterns in here. Because what you're basically saying is, if I can have a single slit over here, and I can have a single slit over here, and the argument is how does combining those 2 things, that is moving them towards each other, moving them into relevance, how do I change the fundamental nature of the pattern? How do I go from a pattern that's this way to a pattern that looks like that? And the real difference is when you bring these 2 together, you're not bringing this distance and just this distance. This isn't the only distance you have anymore, is the distance between these 2 surfaces. Now you have this distance, and you have, I should get the other pen because this one's about had it. Alright, you have this distance, and then you have this distance, and that's what's really creating the difference in the pattern. This outside distance, which is a very large distance, is creating lots of wavelengths of light can fit inside of that distance, right? So that distance has lots of wavelengths, which means there's lots of points where you can have a full wavelength of difference, because the 2 points are very far from each other. So now there's lots of points where there's a full wavelength of difference. So that's creating the little bars in the pattern. And The shorter, smaller distance is this distance here. Very few wavelengths of difference, and that's where the creating the envelope, what's called the envelope pattern. So there's only a few points where those two match, and the point is that the pattern shows up. These little bars show up when all four sources make a contribution. When only two sources make a contribution, it's too dim to see. You don't see anything. When all four sources end up you're going from one location and you're getting pieces from all four sources, and all four sources are in phase, that is, there's a full wavelength of difference between the lines, then you get a photon. You get a visible photon. And so the pattern's really just being made out of having four sources make the contribution, and that's why it has this envelope feature, is because it's really the furthest slits, small resolution, closest slits, much grainier resolution, much more distance. And so that math works. That gets you the right answers. And it also can explain the fact that there is a double maxima in the middle. So that's another thing they say when they're describing this experiment. They'll sit there and talk about how, well, there's two openings and they should just create two patterns, straight ahead, and that the two patterns would misalign. There'd be a heavy bunch here and a heavy bunch here, but they're not considering that this distance is less than a millimeter. Okay, I mean, the distance between the openings is insanely small, and this pattern is very big, so it's spreading with distance. It's getting bigger and bigger, and so you're magnifying it. And the fact is, it's still, you can't change that fact that this is a small distance. So the magnification can't change that. So the fact that this part gets bigger, okay, can't change the fact that this distance between the two patterns is very small. So at a millimeter's difference, even if you had two patterns cast on top of each other, two single slit patterns, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference, because one pattern would just be a tiny millimeter different than the other pattern. They would just overlap each other. And so there wouldn't be two lumps that you could see, because the two lumps would have a center that was only a millimeter apart. So that's another deception. So they kind of imply that this is what you should get, when, no, if you really thought about it, what you should get is two patterns right on top of each other, where you'd almost be impossible to see the difference between them, because they would be so much on top of each other. And so they use this argument to say the center maxima has to be, a light, when it really doesn't, because that's all happening inside of the 1 millimeter. So again, on the surface, what's being created by the two sources being equidistant to that center is all happening within 1 millimeter of the pattern. So the pattern could be a foot across, and you're talking about 1 millimeter being obligated, and the obligation again just has to do with the fact that you can have dissections inside of that 1 millimeter, where you can have on-off inside of it that you'd never be able to see. So anyway, so it's just another way of creating an argument that somehow we know what this answer is, when that's really not the right answer, because the one that'll tell you the most, I guess I need to redraw again, erase, if you really understood the pattern is just a mechanical process, and that it has a finite reality. So that's another advantage of, again, recognizing that even in their math they acknowledge a distance to the target, and the distance to the target mathematically has to stay consistent. So if you're going to do the experiment, you'd have to realize that you really have to view it, on a circle, and that the distance that's going to be the most reliable about what's the pattern's going to look like would be this distance versus this distance. And that'll tell you what this has to be. And what this has to be will tell you what this has to be up here. So the way to really view it is the reason why there's a double maxima is that there are these two sources here, and there's two sources here, and they're separated by a little bit of distance. So one of them's creating a pattern that, say, starts here, and one of them's creating a pattern that starts here. And those two patterns overlap in the middle. And that's why there's a center maxima, okay, that's always an odd number. And that's why it's twice, essentially, you know, -1 of, so like say if there was 2 elements to these nodes, then this one would be 3 here. And if there was 3 here, that would have to be 4, 3 and 3 would be 6, and 1 less is 5. So yeah, there would be 5 here. Okay. So it's always a multiple, because this is just an overlap. This is just 2 3s, and the center one is overlapping, so you don't see it. And that's why there's a double maxima in the center in this single slit, especially, is because there really is these two sources that are separated by some distance, and that's why the pattern really starts here. Okay. And so if you're a full wavelength of difference here, this is going to be an on, and that just changes how much this overlaps. It either overlaps a lot or overlaps a little bit, but it'll be, this is the point that you know for certain is what that's going to look like. So all you have to do is divide this distance, and it'll tell you exactly how many places it's possible to have a wavelength of difference. So if this was 15 wavelengths of light, you know, there's 15 places where there can be in phase, out of phase, in phase, out of phase. There's 15 of them. And so, you know, you can tell this distance, and you can say that would have to be, say, 45. 2 15s plus whatever the middle is. You know, and so these are going to be many more spots in between, because there's many more wavelengths of difference, chances for a wavelength of difference. So the biggest distance is creating the little bars, the smallest distance is creating the big envelope style pattern, and it's perfectly mechanical. You can understand it. And again, the simple argument is the mechanics is just the fact that photons are composite objects. They're not waves, they're not whatever non-fixed, non-real objects flying through space. They're actually made out of something. And although Einstein, I don't think, ever drew a photon, as far as I know, I would argue that the photon is quanta of energy, okay, and that the wavelength is really just the distance between the bits of energy, and that works as an explanation. So the change in the frequency is just the red light is doing this, and the blue light is doing this. Okay, it's just that they're closer together. The bits of force in the field have been compressed by action, okay, and that changes a photon from a red photon into a blue photon is action by an electron pushing, compressing, or in the other case moving away and relaxing the reflections that come off of it and creating the distance. Now the polarization means that they're moving in parallel with each other, and you could argue that this pattern has 2 elements to it. The polarization just means they're running in parallel, so they have their wavelength, but they also have a little difference in where they're created in space, and that would be the polarization. But regardless, the point is that this explanation of just these little bits flying through a slit, and you can argue that the surface is covered in electrons, and the electrons at any one minute are moving out or moving in, moving out, moving in, moving in, moving out of their atoms. They're jiggling. They're moving in and out, in and out. So at any one time, the photon, the little bit of energy, could hit an electron, and the electron's motion, the photon hits it this way, The electron had a motion going out. Now the electron has a motion going in some other direction, and that's where it'll create a new compression in the environment, creating a new photon in that direction. And so each bit hits an electron that's moving. The moving electron creates a scatter, and so you eventually have, again, as laws of probability would state, you have just as much chance hitting an electron going in as you do hitting one going out. And so you basically just scatter the light in all these directions. The little bit is scattered, and the fact is that you can reconstruct this frequency. If you can create a full wavelength of difference between this and this, and you can have a full wavelength of arrival time difference, you can just recreate this wavelength, this frequency at that location. With the pieces that have been scattered. So this piece is scattered first. It travels a shorter distance. This one is scattered. Well, obviously this one has to be scattered first because it's going the longer distance. And then a few milliseconds later, this one scatters, and they both just travel the path. And this one travels its longer path, and they arrive in sequence. This one, then another one at a timed interval. And if that happens 3 times or 5 times or whatever a photon is made out of, then you have a event that takes place on the surface, creating, either a reflectable photon or electricity in the surface, depending on what you're hitting with the photon. But it duplicates the photon that went in, but it's obviously been reconstructed. So the photon gets broken by the surface. It's, pieces are knocked out of the arrangement, and then a new piece is put in from another location to recreate the photon. And that explanation works. It doesn't require any woo. There's no entanglement. There's no communication. The photons aren't hitting each other. The little bits aren't hitting each other. The photon bits, photon isn't hitting photon. Photons are hitting electrons again. Matter bits are mitigating the action of the force. The force hits the electron moves, that changes where the force is going to go. And that simple explanation works. It explains all of the geometry and the dynamics, and there's no reason for any speculations about the photon breaking into 2 pieces and flying through both and then reconstructing. So they will continue to argue that they've done single photon experiments, but that's just, frankly, more exaggeration, overstatement. They can't really be sure they're single photons. So there's a Veritasium video where he claims he did this single photon experiment. And the idea would be is that you would take a very minimal dim light and then let a long period of time pass. So the first guy who did it let the experiment run for 40 days. He went sailing. Okay, so he set up the experiment where he's going to use a photo paper to detect the photons, and the idea is to make it very dark, and then you'd let this very dim source produce photons at this very slow rate and see if you still get the pattern. So we let it run for days, more than a month anyway. And so he had some assurance that these are single photons because, it's a very, very dim light and he only got a dim image on the photo paper. But when Veritasium did, he tried to do it over a long period of time, hours. With, fancy electronics, you can do it over less time. But it didn't work. He couldn't get it to work when he allowed a long period of time to take place and very few photons in the experiment. And it wasn't until he cut the experiment to 5 minutes, where he forced more photons essentially into the experiment, that he actually got a result, which sort of makes it kind of obvious that what's the likely implication of that. Why didn't it work? Well, it didn't work because you can't do it with a single photon. You need a photon to be at one surface, and you need a photon to hit the other surface. It has to hit the surfaces. If there aren't photons hitting all these surfaces, you're not going to be able to reconstruct a photon. So if they actually did a real, single photon experiment, they wouldn't get any pattern because you couldn't put the photons back together, would be the simple argument. Alright, so there was some other thing I wanted to draw, relevant to the experiment. Now I can't remember what it was, but maybe it'll occur to me, so we'll just wait a little bit. But this is, another foundational, so like 1/2 mv squared, this is foundational wave. They all say it's wave-particle duality, but what they mean by that is it's waves. Photons are waves in a medium of some kind, no doubt, because how else could you have a wave? They can't, how do you wave in empty space, and then wave in a laser beam, or wave in a ray of light, or wave in a photon coming from a very distant galaxy somewhere traveling billions of light years. Their argument is somehow there's a wave that's coming through all the space, and I don't know. Doesn't make any sense to me personally. How could the same energy arrive at a location? So you send energy out from a source, and the fact is the energy arrives in clumps, as Feynman would say. The photon that left here, if it hit me here, it would have been just as strong as if it hit me here, or it hit me here, it hit me here. It doesn't matter where it hits me, it's all the same photon. It's not half a photon, it's not a tired photon, it's not a worn out photon, all of that kind of crap. Although that is another argument in terms of using redshift to detect distances in space, and not acknowledging that space doesn't have to get bigger for the light frequency to change, because all the light really has to do is hit something on its way, and that will alter its frequency. So you could explain that redshift as just being a consequence of traveling distance through space that isn't entirely empty. Alright, so what else? There was some other point I wanted to raise, and I have just lost it. That's disappointing. Oh yes, the radar experiment. So another way to detect how bullshit the whole theory is this: they use the example of radar. So radar would be an antenna producing a signal, and then you're going to receive the signal with a receiver. And they say that the radar or radio waves are doing the same interference thing, that somehow the signal is coming off the antennas, and the antennas are at the distance, and that you're getting this place where it's on here, and then it's off here, and then it's back on here, and then it's off here. Alright, so the same Young analysis, it doesn't really have any double slit pattern, so even though you're using two antennas, which implies double slit pattern, it doesn't have any, there's no envelope pattern, there's no pattern inside of a pattern. Okay, that's not happening. So even though, again, it has the same broken continuity, the geometry and the math aren't fitting what they're saying the pattern should be doing, or how you're going to have create the effect. We should be getting a double slit pattern from two radio antennas, not a single slit on, off, on pattern. And so the simple modification you can do to this experiment to basically demonstrate that it can't be waves interfering with each other in this space here that decides whether a photon gets to the surface is just to do the experiment with the antenna on either side of the detector, because you will in fact create the same phenomenon of in phase and out of phase based on distance. So I really should draw the antennas as this way just because they are directional. And so you're going to send your signal from two antennas, and all you have to do is move your space. You move from here to here, and you can create the on-off pattern in this direction. So you can create it going, just moving directionally inside of there and changing your distance from this antenna and your distance to that antenna. So by just moving through that space, you can get the same on-off pattern. And yet, neither one of these waves could interfere with each other. This wave can't be affecting this wave, and this wave can't be affecting this wave, because they're on opposite sides of the receiver. So you have the signal coming from opposite sides, and you have your antenna here. These two waves can't possibly be constructively and destructively interfering with each other. And all I have to do is just, again, move between those two antennas, and I'll create the same exact pattern, because it's really just about the energy coming off, and the fact is it just, again, it's the same argument. You're just reconstructing. Now, the other curiosity that should be understood is that we know this is just radio jamming. That if I did this with a radio signal, and I send the same signal to the same location from two sources, and those two sources are out of phase, the radio can't play. It won't recognize either station. It won't produce any kind of signal at all. The two will just cancel each other out, because the radio receiver can't figure out which one, okay, is the frequencies are coming in like this. And so what does the radio antenna see? It sees this, okay? It sees the wrong frequency. It can't tune on this frequency, because this noise is affecting it. It's the same sequence, but they're not in phase. So when they're out of phase, the radio receiver can't catch this pattern, because all it sees is this pattern. And so it's just jamming, and nobody would think that radio signal jamming has anything to do with interference and all of that crap. It just is understood that the radio receiver is specific, and you can mess it up by disguising another signal as the same signal. You can break the receiver. So this is just a receiver that's broken. It's not really indicating this is like a clock being broken in some relativity argument. This is just a broken receiver. You break the receiver by sending the competing signal out of phase. And the geometry is exactly the same. So the experiment could be explained by jamming, or you can make up some wooey theory that the photons that never interact with each other, the light that you can never bang into another, can't bang a photon into a photon. So in spite of the fact that you can't do that, except in a medium of matter, except putting it into a place where there's atoms that allow for the interaction, but a photon in empty space never interacts with a photon in empty space. You can't make them collide. No reason for you to believe they can interfere with each other. They can collide with each other and combine with each other and do things in space. They really can't. All you can do is break them and then remake them, would be the simple explanation. Alright, so I think that covers enough of it. So it's just a fable that physics tells, a fake story about how they have decisive evidence. Professor Lewin calls it nail in the coffin proof that light's a wave. And none of what they're saying is actually true. They don't really deal with the double slit pattern. They don't explain the features of the real double slit pattern. They just totally ignore it and pretend it's just on-off pattern. And that's just like water waves, when it's not just like water waves in the single slit, and it's not just like water waves in the multi-slit. And it's only in the two slit that water waves look a little bit like light in the single slit. So light in the single slit looks a little bit like water in the double slit, but it's just the superficial, a little bit like it. Okay, the patterns aren't the same. Water doesn't create the double maxima in the center. Water doesn't do the same things that the photon pattern does. There are clear dissimilarities, and instead of paying attention to those clear dissimilarities, they just keep preaching the same tired old 200-year-old fable about how it works. And it's just that. It's a 200-year-old superficially correct but every detail incorrect. Okay, it's mathematically impossible to make the young pattern, the young waves, create a double slit pattern. You can only create a single slit pattern, and it doesn't even do that accurately, because obviously the center of the openings and the slits isn't the right distance. There's no surface in the center of the openings, and the source of the real pattern are the surfaces. The surfaces are causing the effect. So you don't have the right distance if you use the center of the slits. And that's where they have math that contrives an excuse for that, and they actually put a half in there to basically double the distance. But anyway, so there's all kinds of little mathematical tricks. The trick of just ignoring, basically destroying the double slit pattern by saying the slits are so close together that you can only see them as 2-point sources. So just basically eliminate 2 of the sources and turn the double slit pattern into just a single slit pattern. All these little tricks they've pulled to tell a story, and the story isn't the truth. It isn't physically correct. It isn't mathematically accurate. It isn't the most proven theory in the history of mankind or something. It's the story that they've contrived, the way they tell the story, to make it seem plausible when the real details indicate a completely different mechanism. The real details basically prove it's a surface event. Whatever the photons are doing, the ones that hit a surface are the ones creating all the fringe light. None of the fringe light is light going through the slits. All of the fringe light is being created by scatter on surfaces. The surfaces are what's changing the direction of the photons. Alright, I'm satisfied with that, so we'll give you a couple minutes, see if anybody shows up to say anything, and then I'll just get the hell out of here. So we have 7 viewers, which, you know, isn't likely to produce much, but we'll see if anybody has anything to say, and if not, we'll try again some other time. Just making the point that it's just way underanalyzed, and people are just way too accepting of very incomplete and, again, superficially broken explanations. I mean, explanations that are missing obvious details. There's a double maxima in the center. Explain it. There's missing light in the double slit experiment. Explain it. The fact is, it's always been true that you could just use the distance argument, that the number of wavelengths you can put in the distance between the surfaces, the distance you're using in your math, already tells you exactly how many bars there's going to be. You don't have to think about it as, you know, you're casting this on an infinite plane. The argument is no, the light is actually being created in degrees of intervals, and there's only 90 degrees, and there can only be a certain number of points in space that can be ons and offs. And so when you know the distance, you already know how many bars there are, and you already know how big they're going to be. You know, and you don't need any wave theory to explain it, or you don't need geometry that implies the pattern is infinite, which, you know, they actually do. They imply that the pattern goes on and on and on and on, and it really doesn't. It becomes, you know, at the whatever 98-degree angle, there's no change. It's on from 98 degrees to 100, from 89, from let's say 87 degrees to 90 degrees. You know, it's all on because the bars are getting bigger, and it's just all the same bar. You're all within the same wavelength, and so there's no infinite pattern. And such. So 8 viewers. Anyway, yeah, so maybe I'll just end the video. we'll just leave it as an explanation again, an overview video, basically just going through these details that I have gone through numerous times. It's compelling evidence that wave theory is not the right answer, that it can be explained understanding energy to be in discrete chunks into quanta. The real quanta electrodynamics would say, yes, this is what it's made out of. The universe is clumpy, and the fact is there are clumps of energy in the universe. Those clumps of energy in a pattern create something we call a photon. In some other pattern, it's magnetism. In some other pattern, it's gravity. It's all the same force moving the same speed. It's the same little bits of energy, okay? And the fact that it is all traveling the same speed is essentially a huge giveaway that it's all the same stuff, and you're really just saying you can change the way it looks a little bit, and then that'll change how it affects a piece of matter. And the universe can be understood in those simple terms, and you don't need any wooey entanglement or superpositions, and you don't need to think that the universe doesn't know what it's doing because things are in more than one place at the same time, or any of that crap, for which there really is zero physical evidence. And they've always used these experiments, this two-slit experiment, as an excuse, because they're saying there's no other way to explain it, when yes, there is another way to explain it, a very viable and good way to explain it that explains so much more. So obviously it's the better explanation because it tells you why a lot of other things are happening also, and you really don't have to believe this Jesus Messiah story and such. Alright, down to 4 viewers? Oh, well, shit, 8 to 4. So who cares? So, alright, we'll just get out of here. Alright, so till the next time and such and so forth and whatnot. This has been draftphysics.com or debatephysics.com. I guess I'll post these last 2 videos as references for those. Just as a, if you're going to counter argue something in this video. Yeah. Okay. So till the next time.